Richard Reffin says he almost never uses a recess on a bowl if he can help it. Stuart Batty, on the other hand, said a recess is stronger than a tenon. Two strong opinions from two experts. Let's take some time and look at the pros and cons, and more importantly, how to turn a recess properly, which may be more important than whether you personally prefer a recess versus a tenon. Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. My name is Mike Peace, and I'm here to share with you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you become even a better wood turner. If this is something you're interested in, click on the link below and subscribe to make it easier to find future videos. Let's start by making a small dish using a small recess. I like to make these little saucers to keep acorn boxes from rolling around. So I'm going to use this piece of dried chestnut, and we're going to mount it on a threaded glue block. So I'm using medium CA, putting it around mostly on the outside edge because that's where the strength comes from. And then we'll give it a few minutes and then I'll be back. Okay, so we're going to get this up here, and let's just go ahead and let's just shape this thing down a little bit. Now we're going to make this recess for a small set of jaws. I'm going to use these 35mm jaws. And so we're going to take our scroll chuck and we're going to tighten it as far down as it will go, because that's the size of the opening. And probably the best way, in case you didn't see that, crank it all the way down. Now we're going to go ahead and get a set of dividers, and I'm going to use those dividers to set that hole, because we want that hole just small enough where the outer will slide in and no bigger for our best hold. And well, that's interesting. Smaller than I thought. Okay. Go ahead and pull the tailstock out of the way. There's multiple tools. I'll show you a better one in a moment, and that will give us just about the angle we want. We're going to make this about 1/8 of an inch deep, and by coming in that way, got a little bit of a tool mark there, that will give us the dovetail, because this is set at about a 10-degree skew, and that's about what I'm looking for. Now before we use this, what we would normally do is we're going to sand the inside, and for something small like this that I'm going to finish it and not reverse turn it again, we would want to sand all this off, shape the outside, and we would want to come in there with maybe just a little bit of decoration. I'm not going to hit the inside of that wall, just the bottom here. And we're just going to add a little decoration. If we were going to put any embellishing wax or anything, we would do that now. And then if we were going to add any tiny little V grooves, we would do that now. Anything that would tend to dress it up a little bit, beautify a little bit, and to some extent hide the fact that we've left the tenon on there, or rather the recess. Now I would go ahead and finish shaping the whole bottom and sanding it before we reverse turned it. Okay, now we've rounded off. One of the tricks I want to show you that it works especially well on platters, so you can size where the bottom is going to be, is for your tenon, you make the foot the same height right here as the recess, so when you're hollowing the bowl, you'll know exactly where the bottom is. It's going to be right there. Right there. Same. The other thing I want to point out is, although this is a very small bowl, so maybe I can get away with it. we'll see. The wall thickness here needs to be at least a 1/2 inch. And in this case, it's not a 1/2 inch, but I think I can get away with it because it's a very, very small bowl. But I would say keep this shoulder a minimum of a 1/2 inch thick. Ideally, probably as much as three quarters of an inch thick. I've got just a tiny little bevel here. And there we go. That's why I drilled a hole in the side here. Make it easier to get something like this off. And here's the other issue here, is you want to make this snug. Like I say, you want this just big enough for this to slide in, because you want the maximum steel touching the wood into the corners, and I think that 3/8 is plenty. You can see we've got a little bit of a gap here, about 1/8 of an inch, so that's just about the perfect size for maximum steel on the wood. And we're just going to use that again, small bowl gouge, and with something like this, the key is sharp tools. Don't press too hard. Don't get a catch. And that 1/8 inch tenon with only a very shallow wall should hold this just fine. And then we're not going to finish this because it's not about how to turn a little bowl, saucer, or plate, but just to show you that this is holding plenty strong and doesn't show any signs of tearing out, because I don't have that much leverage on it. It's not sticking out this far, and it's not that big. So that little tiny recess did just fine. And by having one small like that, if I don't come back and clean this up, it still doesn't give a bad appearance when you put some decoration in the bottom. So why would somebody want to use a recess rather than a tenon? Well, first of all, as we kind of demonstrated with that small little saucer, that you can save a step by not having to reverse the bowl after hollowing. Now that said, I've seen a lot of bowls that had very unattractive bottoms, and you know, as us men, we like to see attractive bottoms, because the recess was just too deep in the bottom, and it was left that way, so it didn't look very attractive. It works great for platters since it doesn't waste wood. As I've shown, even for a platter, you can hold it with a dovetail with as little as an 1/8 inch deep, and you wouldn't have to remove it, the signs of it. I'm in the camp that I like to remove most of the signs of chucking, so it's not obvious how something was chucked up. And part of that, if you are going to turn it just twice, once on the outside, once on the inside, and not reverse it, as I showed on that little bitty one, it helps if you go ahead and decorate that bottom a little bit. Sand it, finish it, put a little V-grooves or some texturing. Also, the process is very straight and very straightforward in creating a recess. It's also easy to remove. Let me show you some examples. Here's an example of a platter I did many years ago, and I used, as always, I use a recess on the platter. But when I finished that recess, I went back and reversed it, probably using a vacuum chuck, and scalloped this down so it wasn't obvious that there was a recess there. Now and here I use that same trick. The thickness of the foot right here was the same as the distance on the recess. So when I was hollowing it out, I could use this as a reference line, and I knew where the bottom would be, so I wouldn't go through the bottom of the platter or make the bottom so thick that it was clunky. Here's another example of how you can use a recess. On this particular bowl, I have the bowl. I have actually a recess on the inside. So when I went to decorate and finish off the bottom to reduce the size of that recess, so it wasn't so obvious, I sized this with this bead so it was a perfect match for these bowl jaws so I could reverse it. And because I sized the fit just right, the marks were going to be virtually imperceptible on the inside as to how I held it when I cleaned up the bottom. And a dovetail can make for a very strong chucking method if it's done properly, and that key focus is done properly. Okay, we did a smaller recess on a 35 millimeter set of jaws on a small dish. Let's do something a little bit larger. I'm using these pin jaws to initially mount it, where I drill about a 1 1/8 inch hole and drill it deep enough where it faces against the chuck jaws for support. Woodworm screw also works well. Get the right chuck key. And this is a quick and easy and a very strong chucking method using expansion. Okay, now again, I always bring up tailstock support as often as I can for as long as I can to increase safety. All right, I'm going to size this for my 75 millimeter bowl jaw, so I'm going to use a set of dividers to get that appropriate width for this. Careful to put the point only on this side, and then line it up with the other. And there we go. Now we're only going to make this approximately somewhere between a 1/8 and a 1/4 inch, or actually a little less than a 1/4 inch. Somewhere between, say, 3 millimeters and 5 millimeters is kind of the sweet spot. We can get to speed up a little bit, and I'm just going to take out just a little bit of the excess. And I'm using this spindle gouge. Now I'm going to use a dovetail tool that's shaped for being able to do this recess, even though I've got tailstock support, and maybe I'm using a smaller jaw set where you can't easily get in there. Now, if you had free access, you could use a skew or a badan, but if you've got tailstock support, this tool works very well. Here's an example showing what the grind looks like, and I did an article on this for American Association of Woodturners journal a while back. I've got a link to that in the show notes where you can download that article on making one of these. And basically, I'm just going to come in and coming along. Keeping the bottom flat. And let me see if that's a full 1/8 inch deep. I may need to go a bit deeper. I think that'll almost get it. I've got just a little bit of trash in the corner I need to clean up. So let's go at it one more time. And if I'm not planning on reversing this after I finish doing the outside and hollowing the inside, of course, I've got to sand this. I've got to get rid of any unwanted material, and I would possibly decorate this again with V-grooves or beads or texturing. Now, why do some folks' bowls vibrate and chatter and go flying off the lathe when they're using a recess? Well, let's explore some of those reasons. The first reason is they probably didn't shape the recess to match the chuck jaws. Now, most chuck jaws have an external dovetail of about 10 degrees. Now, it's not critical if you're off just a little bit, as long as you don't make it too steep. Let me show you a diagram. Okay, let's look at some recess details. First, let's look at an example of a really good recess and the factors that go into it. Okay, the first thing we see here is we've got a good dovetail. It's kind of hard to see on this small detail, but it's 10 degrees, which means that, and it's the appropriate size, so this will just slip in the hole and then tighten up to the correct size of the chuck jaws to form a perfect circle. That dovetail is about 10 degrees. A couple of degrees in either direction is not going to make much of a difference. The depth of this is somewhere between, let's say, 1/8 of an inch to maybe 1/4 of an inch. The shoulder between the recess on the inside and the outside is going to be somewhere probably 3/4 of an inch or stronger. For small pieces, sometimes you can get away with less, but that's going to prevent any blowout or ripping out that recess. One trick I want to point out, which I think I might have mentioned before, is when you do make it, if you'll make a foot right here exactly the same height as this, when you're shaping the inside, you'll know exactly where the bottom of that's going to be. So kind of keep that in mind. Now let's look at some examples of problems with tenons. Probably one example is, instead of a dovetail, they've got it either going the wrong way, going inward, or it's just not dovetailed. Either way, the chuck jaws are not going to get the hold. Certainly they won't get any hold here except at the very edge, and then they'll probably force their way out. And if it's parallel, it's just not going to be nearly as strong. Another example of one that's a problem is if you make it too deep. You make it deeper than the actual dovetail is on the jaw, which generally is not going to exceed a quarter of an inch. And here's an example of that. So what happens is when you get it in there, instead of resting in the corner on that dovetail, it's actually getting part of the lower part of the jaw that's just not taking advantage of that dovetail strength, and you just get a very, very poor hold. Now I've exaggerated this just a little bit, this size, but okay, you've got a good dovetail. Let's say you've got it the right depth, but you don't get a clean shoulder here, you get it rounded. Then what's going to happen is those chuck jaws, I needed a larger diagram here, but the chuck jaws are just not going to register in that corner like they should. That curved area is going to force it down, and then you're going to lose that strength of having the face of the jaws rest against the bottom of the bowl. Another example is if the dovetail is cut at too acute an angle. Again, this is somewhat exaggerated. But the issue then is that dovetail, when the dovetail jaw gets in there, it's going to crumble on this area right here because it's just not fitting, it's just not matching it at all. It's going to be more like this, and it's going to crush that area in the corner. Another potential problem that you've got with the dovetail, actually let's make it a little more dovetail here, is you shape the bottom and you've kind of curved it in a little bit, and then the issue then is that dovetail the chuck jaws are going to not be able to get into the corner properly because of this inward shape. In addition, you increase the risk of going through the bottom with this coming up slightly. You've got something similar if you have a dovetail. Again, this is exaggerated, where it's bulging in the middle. In the very middle, it wouldn't be a problem, and it could enhance the appearance. But the problem is the top of your jaws are going to register right here, and then you're not going to get that strength of having it register along the top of those jaws. So those are all examples of problems with the recess. Okay, again, imagine us slicing off the part that's in the chuck. So we're looking down into the bottom. If you're using green wood, the end grain is very hard. The side grain is easier to compress. So if you have it set oriented in this direction, where these two opposing jaws are going right into end grain, which doesn't compress well, the side is going to compress more, then you're going to have an uneven or a wobbly or a loose fitting with green wood as you compress, and you continue to tighten it as some of the water comes out. You're going to get more compression in this direction than you would this direction. So the trick is pretty simple. You just orient it at 45 degrees, and you're going to wind up with a uniform, each jaw is going to be hitting the wood grain in the same direction. Again, if dry wood, it wouldn't make much of an issue because the wood's not going to compress much anyway because it's not wet, it's dry. But for green wood, this is an important consideration. One of the reasons is you don't have the right size chuck jaws. If you've got a big platter, you want a larger set of jaws, not a smaller set of jaws. If your recess is just too small for the size, it's substantially less. Once you start approaching a ratio of 1 to 5, in other words, a 2-inch recess with a 10-inch diameter, once the object gets larger than that, you're treading on dangerous territory, and you'd want to have a larger set of chuck jaws. Another reason for vibration or tossed bowls could very well be you're using returning a green bowl that was turned green, and you're returning it, and you did not true up the recess, so you've got it longer in one direction than it is in the other. In other words, it's oval. Here's an example. This is not a recess, it's a tenon, but the difference on this sweet gum between with the grain and against the grain is about 1/4 of an inch. So if you didn't true it up when you're returning the bowl, you're going to have an issue. But I'm guessing the biggest reason that most folks are going to wind up having vibration or toss the bowl is generally probably a problem with their turning technique. It could be their tool is not sharp. It could be that they're not riding the bevel. It could be that they're scraping, or and let me tell you, the next one gets into a little war story. So first few months I was turning, I did a bowl with a recess, and I ripped the bowl off the chuck. I took it to a meeting that night and passed it around during show and tell to get some feedback what went wrong, and people looked at it and they would comment about this dovetail was too steep, or it was too shallow, or it wasn't flat, or it didn't leave big enough shoulder. But this older gentleman behind me with a British accent turns it over and looks inside the bowl, and he points out and says, "Here's your problem. You had this tremendous catch right here, and it didn't make any difference what kind of recess you had. It was going to tear it off the chuck." His name was Alan Batty. We've talked about some of the reasons why recess is a good idea. Let's look at some reasons why it may not be a good idea. First of all, it reduces the depth in which the bowl can be hollowed out, and that can make a bowl look heavier than it really is. It can limit the foot design because the size recess you're using, it's going to be, you can't make the foot any smaller than that, plus the shoulder around it. For example, if you've got a 2-inch recess on a larger bowl with a 3/4 inch supporting shoulder around it, that's 1.5 inches. You're looking at a 3.5 diameter foot minimum. And a general rule of thumb of a bowl is a foot ought to be maybe at about 1/3. So if you had a smaller bowl, let's say 8 inches, that foot's going to make it look kind of chunky and clunky. So if you like doing recesses and you're turning smaller bowls, you might have to invest in a smaller set of jaws, such as the 35 millimeter jaws that I use quite a bit. another issue is making that shoulder. If you make that shoulder too thin, now in this example, I've got lots of shoulder, but as I mentioned before, you want at least a minimum of a 1/2 inch, probably closer to 3/4, and then on a really large bowl, maybe even an even thicker shoulder to prevent any the thing from tearing out as you're expanding into that recess. Some folks feel strongly about not having their final piece make it obvious how they held it on a chuck, so they don't want a prominent recess on the bottom, and I'm in that camp. So on most of the platters that I turn, and here's three examples, when I finish it, I'm going to go back and clean up that recess so it doesn't look as prominent. Here's one out of black limba, same way. This one out of Bradford pear, same thing. No obvious recess. This is an older one. I was probably using the normal jaws, and that was probably the recess right here. Which if I left the recess, because it's a platters, you're generally going to have a foot closer to maybe 50 to 70% of the diameter of the wood to make them nice and stable when they're holding something. If you have too big or too small a recess and you left it, it's going to look disproportionate. Now, if you got a larger set of jaws, then you can handle that. But for a lot of us, when you first start out, you're using your normal jaws, so that is an issue on aesthetics. So whether you use a dovetail or whether you use a recess is to some extent personal choice. They're both effective methods of holding the wood on the lathe, as long as they're both done properly, and that's the key. So I hope some of these techniques have helped you. I'd appreciate it, especially if you're a new time viewer, what one takeaway did you get out of this video? If you missed the video that I did earlier on turning a tenon, here's a link above. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.